I'd like to introduce to you our panel today. Kitty Chu is a transportation planner. She works with cities, transit agencies, planning authorities, and private organizations to uncover ways to leverage transit technology and demand responsive transit to improve the efficiency of mobility services and provide access to underserved communities. Kitty has worked at VIA in prior jobs and has worked as a consultant at WSP as part of the emerging mobility strategies and future ready teams, where her work focused on developing strategies for agencies to better prepare for the future of transportation and cities more generally. Kitty holds a bachelor's degree in urban planning and a master's degree in transportation engineering from the University of Waterloo in Canada. Stephen Miller, who is an alum of our Bachelor's of Science in Urban and Regional Studies here. Stephen Miller is responsible for external communications to public transit riders, partner transit agencies, the press, and policymakers at Transit, the app to get around without a car in more than 300 cities worldwide. So prior to joining Transit's Montreal-based team, Stephen Miller was a journalist covering New York City transportation and politics in the Village Voice, Gothamist, City Lab, and Streets Blog. Previously, he served as legislative director for a member of the New York City Council and worked as a bicycle and pedestrian advocate with Rails to Trails Conservancy. Originally from Rhode Island, Stephen has a bachelor's degree in urban and regional studies from Cornell University and a master of urban planning from Pratt Institute. Wenfei Tsai's work centers people in the design, policy, and governance of the built environment and its transformations. She's currently director of global policy for cities and transportation at Uber, where she leads a team focused on creating a sustainable, inclusive, and multimodal future. Prior to Uber, she founded Make Public, a social impact analysis firm that specialized in social metrics for the public realm, and she was the executive director of Gale Institute, a nonprofit that advocated for public life and public spaces. She served on the NYC Public Design Commission from 2015 to 2019 and taught urban design at Columbia University's Graduate School for Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, as well as the Parsons School of Design at the New School. Wenfei has served as Deputy Executive Director of Transit Center, a national foundation focused on improving urban transportation, and Director of the Cities and Transportation Program under the Energy and Climate Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Her work was included in the 2012 Venice Biennale for Architecture and was most recently published by the Urban Design Forum, Common Edge, and SF MoMA's Open Space. She holds a bachelor's degree from Cornell University and a Master of Science degree from the London School of Economics. And lastly, but definitely not least, Kevin Webb. Kevin directs the Open Transport Partnership, a nonprofit helping communities build just and sustainable transportation systems. He previously worked at Open Plans, Sunlight Foundation, the transport technology consultancy Conveyal, and as an entrepreneur in residence at Sidewalk Labs. And today, our moderator will be our very own Nicholas Klein, a professor of assistant professor in our department. Nick's research contributes to two central areas of transportation planning: understanding the factors that influence how people travel on a daily basis and how these changes play out over the course of their lives. So with that, Nick, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Wenfei, and thanks to the audience for being here and to our panelists. I'm really excited for this panel. Wenfei and I have a couple of questions that we've come up with. Hopefully it's a lively discussion and we don't even get through all of them because you're all talking so much. It's nice to see you all. Some of you I've met before, and some of you it's new to meet. I think to start out, it'd be really good, because we have many students in the audience, to hear from you. We heard your bios. And it'd be really nice to sort of try and connect the dots so you could talk a little bit about sort of how you got to where you are. And I think for the first round, I'll call on you. And maybe after that, hopefully you're so eager to talk that I don't even need to call on people and the conversation just moves along. Maybe, Stephen, I'll pick on you first to tell us sort of how you got to working at Transit. What was the path like, especially thinking about lessons for students in the audience?
Sure. So after I graduated from URS, I moved to DC and started working at Rails to Trails Conservancy. Kind of during my time at Cornell, I really became interested in transportation specifically, and went to work on bike and pedestrian advocacy. It was really what I ended up doing in my spare time that kind of set the path for the rest of my career, I guess. I started writing blog posts for Greater Washington, which is a blog in the DC area that focuses on transportation and development and all sorts of urban planning issues. And so I did that basically for free on the side. And it was after I moved to New York for my grad program that a position opened up at Streets blog to report and write full-time about transportation and transportation advocacy in New York. So I jumped at that chance, and it was because of what I'd been doing at Greater Washington that they were like, oh, yes, you can write, and you can write about these things. So I worked for Streets blog for 3 years, kind of it's an advocacy journalism outlet focused on making streets better for biking, walking, and public transit. And then I ended up in Montreal. My plan was not to leave New York. I ended up in Montreal for my partner. I moved for love. And it was only because I was involved with Transportation Camp in New York, which is a kind of annual unconference where people suggest their sessions at the start of the day as opposed to kind of prepared presentations. And I had met somebody from Transit App who came to New York for Transportation Camp. And then like a couple months later, it turned out, oh, guess what? I was moving to Canada. And so we started having discussions, and I started work on, it was a smaller team, about 20, 25 people at the time. And so I started work on working with the transit data feeds that we receive from transit agencies and writing a few press releases on the side. And that over the past 5 years has grown into focus full-time on communications with a team of 4. So basically we do everything that is written, whether that's in-app copy, working with our partner transit agencies and their marketing teams, blog posts, social media, case studies, all that good stuff.
Thanks so much. Why don't we go to Kevin next?
Hey, thank you. So I think background on my side is a little more complicated. I think there's been kind of 2 halves of my career, and I'll talk about the last half first, which I think is probably more relevant to the broader discussion we're having, which is I got really lucky in maybe 2011 to get a job working at Open Plans, which was the same organization that incubated Streets blog and a lot of other really amazing kind of things in civic technology space. And as part of that team, I was working with a bunch of folks on kind of technology and data landscapes around transportation. And it just at a really neat moment in time, a lot of really cool people kind of all showed up at Open Plans to work on these sort of projects. And we got a chance to learn from each other, kind of see where the industry is going, and really just kind of explore some of these questions. I think the biggest thing that came out of that is just like a highlight of my career is one of the interns that worked with us on the team is now a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, building on the same tools and technology and data landscape that we were building an open source at Open Plans. It just kind of has been a really neat thing to see how that's evolved over a decade. And that's led to the work I've done in the last 10 years or so. But I think for me professionally, there's actually a more complicated story, which actually began at Cornell. And before that, I grew up in the South as like an ex-urban kid in a metropolitan area that was just kind of baffled by how bad the infrastructure was in the United States, which led me to actually City and Regional Planning program at Cornell as an undergrad at the Urban Regional Studies. And when I showed up, I was really interested in kind of how transportation systems work and trains work and all those sort of questions, and got really lucky to have Professor Goldsmith, who was the chair of the department at the time, teaching that course. And on the very first day of the course, he said, I'm sorry to everybody that came here to talk about trains and buses and transportation. That's not what we're going to discuss. That's not what cities in the United States are actually about. The cities in the United States are about power and who has it and who doesn't and how power is apportioned. And so that's what you're going to learn about for the next 4 years. And if that was a mistake, my apologies. We didn't communicate that ahead of time. And I think a lot of people were really shocked. I think I was one of them. And then as a result of that, I actually decided not to pursue city planning as a career, because I think Professor Goldsmith had a pretty strong point that there's some really fundamental gaps in the way we think about the profession and the problems we're actually trying to solve. And so I went on and spent 10 years working in technology industry, software development, ran an industrial design firm and a bunch of years, and did a bunch of totally other things, and was actually about to go into banking regulation because I cared about public interest challenges around financial crisis, and had the job opportunity to end up at Open Plans and decided to do that instead. And now I think over the last 10 years, what I've realized getting back into transportation just through this technology lens is that Professor Goldsmith is profoundly right. And that we don't talk about power enough in this field, and that there really aren't places that have those discussions. And a lot of the discussion we're having about technology over the last decade that I've been a part of and complicit in has actually been a way to avoid conversations about power. And that's kind of where I think I'm at in my career right now.
Great. That's a great start to our conversations. Kitty, why don't you go next?
Sure. So I think I'm maybe complete opposite from Kevin in the sense that my path was maybe a little bit more traditional. I was very much a transportation planner, and I guess the past year or so I've been working with VIA, and I'm kind of in the midst of transitioning back into a more traditional side of transportation. So I'm kind of a transportation planner that got a peek into the transit tech world just for a little bit. So as Wenfei said, I started my education as in urban planning at the University of Waterloo. They have a co-op program. And so throughout my studies, I was kind of working part-time and studying part-time as well. And so during that time, I did a lot of jobs that had kind of little bits and pieces of transit, but also infrastructure. I worked for the Ministry of Infrastructure for a little bit, and also in active transportation. But I knew that I wanted to do public transit. So when I graduated, my first job out of school was with Metrolinx, the Regional Transportation Authority in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And I was part of the systems planning team. And as an intern, basically, my whole job was to kind of absorb what everyone else was doing and just kind of pick up things that everyone else was working on. And at the time, we were working on the regional transportation plan update. So you can probably imagine that there's a lot of different pieces that go into that. There's studies around the traffic conditions, the existing transit system. But at the time, there was also a lot of talk about emerging technology. And there was just a lot of confusion, I think, at the time, from the perspective of the transit agencies, like, what are we supposed to be doing with all these new technologies? And so partway through my time there, I started my master's degree, and then I also ended up switching jobs and working for WSP, engineering consulting firm, and kind of continued my work on the regional transportation plan from the consulting side, but still with very much a lens of helping the transit authority figure out what they were supposed to do with all these emerging mobility options. And so a lot of my work early on was studying what people were talking about around the world relating to these emerging technologies, and trying to take a more pragmatic approach to viewing how these could potentially be tools that transit agencies could use, and kind of dispelling some of the myths associated with new technologies. I think at the time there was a lot of hype around emerging technologies, including people who were saying that, oh, nobody will ever have to drive in the future. It will be all automated vehicles, and people can like work out in their vehicles, or like basically live out of their vehicles for the rest of their lives, and it'll be great. So trying to dispel some of those like ridiculous claims about what we might see in the next decade, which I think now we know did not happen as they had expected. And so a lot of my work at WSP as a transportation consultant really framed me up to eventually taking my role at VIA. So I was studying a lot and doing a lot of work relating to, I guess, advising cities on how they should be working with transit tech companies. And then eventually I realized I was telling people a lot of things, giving a lot of advice, but I never had the experience on the other side. And so I picked up a job on the other side, working with VIA, mostly in their partnerships team. So really dealing with cities and agencies from the other side, trying to figure out what their challenges are with regards to mobility, and seeing how I could use the technology solutions that VIA provided on the on-demand transit side to help solve some of their problems. But yes, as I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of in the transition back to the transportation space now.
Great, wonderful. So Wenfei, do you want to go last? Wrap us up.
Yes, I will. Yes, great to be here. So my name is Wenfei. I lead global cities and transportation policy for Uber, and I am as surprised as anyone else that I am there, I would say, as a beginning, because I certainly did not start my career thinking that I was going to be in planning or cities or anything like that. I have a blend of experiences, I think personal experiences that of Kevin, of having grown up in a very suburban setting in a cul-de-sac and not being able to walk anywhere and feeling quite isolated. And then a move to a city after college, actually, that made me realize it didn't have to be that way. It wasn't even a big city, it was Boston, so but it was eye-opening. And my first job was actually in technology strategy. I got a chance to travel globally and visited much larger places. And one of the things I discovered I'd like to do was go to all the public spaces and arrive there by transit. And so I got really interested in public space and public realm and how those kinds of places were created. And I will just make this long story short, through my various experiences from bicycle advocacy, architecture, even community development corporation, transit, public transit philanthropy, foreign policy think tank, all of those things. The policy side is really what reinforces the built environment and shapes the built environment, and sort of creates the conditions under which the built environment is shaped. So I got dragged into transportation, and that's how that happened. And so it was a very circuitous route, but I think that right now, I think what my role does is essentially allow me to build on all those experiences from all these different vantage points. I was really lucky to have seen how things change, how policy is made, how communities can advocate, what are the tools that enable that advocacy, and what sort of leadership is required to make that happen. So I think through that, I feel like I bring all those threads together and my work is trying to help a company, stay on track to fulfill some of these larger shared goals, and to kind of perform as best as it can under these conditions. But it is a company, and so that's some of the kind of conditions that I think that we should be realistic about.
Great. So thanks so much. I really appreciate that almost all of you touched on themes that we'll hopefully get to today. Questions about power and money and myths and hype, and the role of government and role of private practice. So I think I want to start by talking about data, right? And so one of the questions I have, and I'm always curious to hear, lots of technology companies, new transportation technology companies talk a lot about the amount of data they have, right? And that it's supposedly new data. And I would love to hear about examples and experiences you can talk about where you or others have been able to use that data to learn things we wouldn't learn otherwise, right? And where that could be used, and where those kinds of data and information have used to make cities or transportation better in cities, if that makes sense. Do you have a question, Stephen? You look like you're confused.
Yeah, no, I'm not confused. I just have a thought, which is I feel like often when discussions come up about data, it can get kind of muddy because there's all different sorts of data, right? Like, are we talking about data that, like, for example, we use to show where public transit services are available? Are we talking about users' personally identifiable information? Are we talking about location data? Are we talking about feedback data from users, right? Are we talking about feedback data that's active in terms of affirmatively saying, yes, I want this, or no, I want that? Or are we talking about kind of passive feedback data in terms of how they're using the application, right? There's all sorts of different ways. There's different types of data out there and different ways it can be put to use. So I feel like, as we respond, I feel like it helps us to be specific and clear about those, how we're using those different types of data and what purposes they serve.
I want to know, Nick, who was telling you that that they have a lot of data?
Oh my God, that
Like, who's saying that stuff?
isn't that always
I'm
the
not saying
story
that
about
stuff.
micromobility companies, microtransit companies, ride-out companies, that they have so much information about where people going, how they're traveling. Is your point that you at Uber don't actually have a lot of data?
I don't know how a company would be like, we have a lot of data, you need to work with us. I actually don't really understand that proposition.
maybe I can start, because I think I'll wear my VIA hat for just a second. VIA is a transit tech company that works very directly with government. So it is a B2G company. VIA essentially provides software to power on-demand transit. So at the end of the day, those transit systems, those microtransit or on-demand transit systems, belong to the transit agencies or the government agencies that work with them. So in that sense, the data that's generated out of those microtransit systems does belong to the transit agencies. It's typically in a shared type of approach. And so I would say there is a lot of data that's generated out of the behaviors of the transit users that is really useful for helping to plan better cities, inform city building in ways that I think traditional forms of data have been much more challenged in providing. So for example, if you have a, say, microtransit zone that just has free floating, you can travel from anywhere to anywhere within that zone. You don't know where people are traveling, you don't know what your demand flows are, but now you have all this data because people are actively requesting rides within that transit zone. And so you start to see some of these origin destination flows that you would otherwise not have had access to. You might have some like travel survey data that may have given you some indication of what that looked like, but it's never going to be as precise as what it would look like if somebody was actually requesting a ride as they would in a system like that. So that, I guess that's like one way, but of course, I think VIA and like other microtransit systems has a very, very different relationship with transit agencies.
And I appreciate that. Definitely that data belongs to the city or the transit agency. But I think those trips are not the majority of the volume of trips of travel, right? And I really think, I kind of like +1 to Stephen's comment, like, what are we actually trying to unpack here? Because I do think that's like one input, right? Microtransit on-demand rides can provide a very small sliver of the kind of activity people want. I feel like we don't know the vast majority of what people are doing, actually.
I just want to second what Wenfei just said, and I think that, you know, my experience, I had a chance to work with Uber on some of this stuff, so I know a little bit about that side. But I wanted to share a story from before that. Actually, what took me to work at Alphabet and Sidewalk Labs is I was extremely interested in location data that was being generated by consumer devices as an input to public policy, and was really excited by, you know, Google has the largest collection of location data, you know, arguably in the world, and it had ever been created in human history. It must be something really cool we can answer with this data. So I went to work there. And what I learned in working there, and I think this is public information, is that that data is really not that useful in a lot of respects for these problems. And I work with some of the smartest people in the world thinking about this, who their answer was like, oh my gosh, like, please don't use this to do this thing that you're asking us to do. It doesn't tell you this. Like, it absolutely does not tell you, for exactly the reasons Wenfei was just describing. Like, the samples and the ways it represents, you know, information, they're not designed to support public policy questions. They're designed to support advertising tracking and Google's advertising network, and they don't work that well for that, arguably, or they work, you know, with severe limitations. So when you have a bunch of people showing up being like, now we want to think about, you know, transportation equity, and we're going to use this data to support this conversation, they're like, no, like, you absolutely cannot do that.
Yeah.
And the thing that came away from this, I've been kind of sounding this over and over, just, you know, kind of ringing this bell every chance I get, is that, like, this was told to me by the people at Google, is like, calibration for public policy is a public responsibility. Like, we built the census into the Constitution of the United States as a public responsibility because it's really hard to do that. Like, you can't measure things in policy lens without spending an enormous undertaking and building some really complicated infrastructure that is problematic to do it. And you have to be really thoughtful about it. And you definitely don't want a private company doing that for you. So their response to that was like, if you want to use this for public policy, the folks that are responsible for policy need to step up and think about how we're going to calibrate this information to answer those questions. And no one I've ever met in public policy realm has taken on that request. I haven't met anyone else interested in that.
I think there's also like a framing around the different types, kind of drilling down into, yes, there are different types of data, but there's also what we do with it, right? There's the kind of smart city framing, right? Which is basically you're taking this like exhaust data of how people, what trips people are taking, how they're using a city or a system, and then using that to then inform decisions, which has all sorts of pitfalls for the reasons Kevin mentioned. And to me, I think what might be more interesting is more kind of affirmative data, right? Because right now decision-making is really driven by, whoever shouts the loudest or complains the loudest or organizes most effectively to shout collectively the loudest is able to kind of move the conversation and shift decisions. And so having more opportunities and having more opportunities for people to constantly give feedback, right? Because people aren't going to fill out the customer comment form. People aren't going to show up to that public meeting. And the people who do are, not necessarily always representative of the population at large, right? So not to say that, app users themselves are always representative of the public at large either, but it is a very prevalent method of engagement for people. And so we should be able to take advantage of that to say, for example, like, we started asking questions of people in the app, right? When they are on at the bus stop, we say, oh, looks like the bus didn't come. Like, was it a ghost bus that like should have come and was never operated? How safe do you feel at this stop or on the vehicle? Is the bus clean, right? And so providing opportunities for people throughout their day to provide that input and that feedback, I think can be obviously beneficial to the transit agency in terms of making decisions, but it's one input, right, into this larger process that we can develop.
Zachary looks like he's dying to say something.
Zachary, you asked the question. You've been called on by the panel.
So I guess I'm just wondering, there certainly is data that these companies have. I guess I'm missing your point, Wenfei. Uber and Lyft routinely put statements out there that they say their data supports. I was in California during the Proposition 22 campaign. The companies put out joint statements in newspapers, worked with Mothers Against Drunk Driving to get them to endorse Proposition 22 based on statistics they used about when people drive and ride and the benefits this supposedly has for getting drunk drivers off the roads. There's pushback between them and labor activists about how many hours and the cost of the services. So I guess I'm scratching my head as I hear your response to Nick's question and questioning if you really have rich data.
I'm not saying we don't have rich data. I'm wondering, to Kevin's point, is there a public policy purpose for that kind of data? You are referring to a campaign, which data is utilized in a very specific way. And the data points that you're referencing are surveys to drivers. Gig economy workers are a very small sliver of the overall workforce population. So should you be making public policy for a very small population about general city planning based on that data? That's the question I'm asking.
And I want to jump on that, Wenfei, and kind of, one thing I also want to flag is like, just in front of level-setting these kind of conversations is that I think it's really important to talk about like, companies and policies different than people in this case. I mean, Wenfei and I have talked about this a lot. I've talked to a lot of people here. Like we have like really complicated views about these issues, and they're different from the things that companies are doing in policy realm. And I think it's really, in this kind of context, is really useful to talk about those in the abstract. And the thing I wanted to flag here is that I think that what I've seen, and I came at this, I started the nonprofit I worked on, and I got to work with Uber and see some of the data and learn about the trade-offs in it. But the conversation I was actually interested in was actually more heavily regulating private sector and using this data to do that. And what I discovered in my work in working with this data was not that the data was or wasn't valuable for regulation, it's that the public sector did not have a regulatory thesis that they were putting forward about what that regulation would involve. And I talked to people in the transportation realm, their interests were actually not in regulating companies, they were in regulating the public realm. And so they got very confusing very quickly, because you're talking about, I want data from Uber to make my street work better, when the conversation you're really trying to have is like, I need to make Uber work better, and I need to regulate Uber, and I need data to understand that regulatory question. But to do that last thing, which I absolutely needs to happen, you have to have a point of view on what that regulatory framework is going to be. And what took place, Prop 22 is a really interesting example in this. And when I started Shared Streets, I thought that the regulatory framework for private sector was going to be through labor regulation. I thought that was actually, I mean, I come at this as someone who, my wife has worked at the Department of Labor, and I have friends that work in unions, and thought about this stuff and fought some of these cases on the side of Uber. And I was like, I think that, labor is the right frame to do it. I never met a single person in transportation policy that was interested in having a conversation about labor policy. And when Prop 22 actually played out in California, to my astonishment, there was zero city involvement in the state of California in AB5, and there was no involvement whatsoever in Prop 22 until after it was already clear it was going to pass. And I was working with people who were like in court battles, like in litigation with Uber over regulatory frameworks, and they had completely oblivious to what was going on the labor side. The only example I found actually that came up was when, after COVID, City of Los Angeles decided they wanted to get some more unemployment revenue tax, and they realized that getting involved in an employment classification case would be a really great way to help fill up the unemployment tax. And that's nothing to do with transportation. They didn't even call the Department of Transportation. They didn't even have a conversation about it. So that's our lack of framework there. It's like we didn't have a policy theory we're putting forward.
I would just add to that. Oh, sorry, Kitty, you were going to say something.
Go ahead.
All right. If I can just add to that, right? Like, there's often when like questions about data come up, it's like assuming that the data will answer the question on its own, right? And you have to have the kind of policy framework. Our CEO was just invited to a panel for like Montreal downtown business leaders, and it was all about like the thesis of this panel was, how can data help save downtown? And he was like messaging with me, and he's like, I don't know what to say here. Like, what is the point of this event, right? And I was like, well, maybe you should go in and be the party pooper and say this is not how it works. But you have to have a policy framework, right? Like, what are the things that can make a downtown strong? Are people working there, people living there, from the transportation perspective, right? Streets that achieve those goals and the design tactics that achieve those goals. Then the data can be used to support those arguments, but it's not going to guide the decision making.
I definitely agree with all the other panelists. I think it's really important when you're thinking about this data to consider what the question actually is. There's definitely a lot of data out there, but whether or not it can answer a lot of the regulatory questions that I think a lot of our panelists are much more interested in is still a question to be determined. I guess like when I was talking about the data coming from microtransit, I think there's a lot of ways that from a technical standpoint, there can be some ways that these new technologies can be used as, in some ways, probes or proxies for questions that we do want to answer from a technical perspective, where historically the ways that we've collected data have been very challenging, been very inefficient. And so these are ways that we can help to improve the efficiency of the data collection. The way that we've used data in the past is really just as kind of a proxy for what potential transit flows could look like. So that's like one very, very specific question, but definitely can't answer questions around all the other things that are involved in that transit space. And Zachary had a comment in the chat. So Zachary, do you want to speak up?
I know. Do you want to put your cases in the chat or we can move on?
I mean, Nick, as the proctor, I don't want to take away from the panel and
Zachary,
other discussions that people
already
have.
allotted
Nick
time for
knows
you
that I
to
can
make
have this
several questions.
conversation ongoing, but yeah.
Why don't we, no, I appreciate that. I do appreciate your comment, Zachary, your earlier one and the one in the chat. I think, I mean, I think it is a disconnect, right? And I think Stephen's example is a good example where like a lot of people, right, whether, you know, they're in this room or on the panel, right, say that many of these new transportation technology companies have, or transportation or technology companies in general, whether it's Google or Transit, right, or whoever, right, have a lot of data that can, what was the save downtown, right? Like, or do something, right? And so I think I share a skeptical view that like the data can answer questions we care about. And I think I just wanted to sort of hear you guys talk about whether that is the case or sort of pour some cold water on the idea and so forth.
Could I just add one more thing on that theme? There's one really quick thing. I'm going to share a link, and I don't know if you can send this to people who are in the room, but this is a paper about, it's by a sociologist or a systems kind of like sociological modeling professor. And it really, it's really worth reading. It's very brief, but basically the argument they're making is that you can't create you can't do this kind of a priori where there's some data that's going to answer some undefined question. It actually does the other way, and you really start from what's your theory of the world that you're trying to build and inform, and then how do you work back from that? And just to give an example of what that means in the context of Uber, absolutely Uber should share data with cities. There's no question they should be compelled to do it. I spent several years trying to compel cities to do it more effectively, or get cities to compel Uber to do it more effectively, and they weren't able to for political reasons, which is unfortunate. But the thing that they should have compelled was how much the drivers were being paid and how much the customers were being charged on the rates were being set. And that's not what transportation policymakers are interested in. That's a labor question, and it's a market regulation question that's traditionally held by taxi authorities, which is completely separate from transportation policy. Look at New York City. They've been incredibly effective in regulating Uber compared to other cities in the United States because the taxi regulator drove the regulation. The taxi regulator shared data with the Department of Transportation, but they were not interested in transportation policy questions. They had a leadership that was interested in making sure poor people didn't get screwed over by corporations and trying to figure out how to manage a market effectively. And they had a bunch of economists working for them that thought about that problem.
You might be surprised to hear this, but I agree with Kevin. And working at Uber, but Kevin, you know, it's nice to have an external person do some validation. And I mean, yes, there's always going to be resistance from especially operators to share data unless you are contractually servicing, right, a city. For a private sector, there has to be some kind of business reason or a business case generally, unless, as Kevin is pointing out, you're compelled or mandated to do it. We are actually regulated into doing it in many places beyond New York City. So now we have a big regulatory data team that deals with that and compliance, and none of these actually, many of these are not in transportation policy. They're not dealing with transportation policy at all. They're dealing with insurance. They're dealing with other issues. But to Kevin's point, for other reasons in New York City, the team is actually going to start sharing more transparency around earnings and even the take rate of, because there's a big congestion pricing conversation going on. So, you know, like it's really useful in that case for everyone to understand what exactly a private sector company is actually, you know, getting what their slice of the pie is if we're talking about, you know, building a big pot together, right, to fund public transit. I think that's a really interesting case, and something to watch is how New York City, all the different actors in New York City, like what are the politicians and the leadership really focused on versus what actually needs to be solved in order to build the $1 billion, you know, pot that you need to really make a difference on congestion and invest in transit. It's a big question.
And I don't want to derail this too much with this thing, but I think there's another thing that's really worth, you know, digging into here is that there's a much more fundamental question that's at play. You know, Uber was, I think, you know, one of the reasons why this competition has been so hard to have is Uber was a very polarizing company it had a significant impact on the urban core in a lot of cities, and we rightfully have a conversation, about what that impact was and how to measure it and how to hold people accountable. But the reality is that the things that were actually being changed were actually more fundamental questions about how we think about common carriage, which is it's a kind of a concept that is more fundamental than the impact that a company like Uber had on public realm. It's actually like, how do we think about the right to use public space and how we apportion that right? And the legal frameworks that were there around that are in common carriage were actually upset by Uber and upset by a number of other companies in ways that we have not addressed. And this is really about pricing and rate setting and whether or not everyone pays the same service. And I think that one of the things that was really fundamental in what Uber did as a company was it allowed itself to set the rates for private enterprise using the public space in a way that was not an open market. And there was no push for transparency into that price setting. So like the economic model that was built to cross-subsidize trips and the subsidy to riders and to drivers, and the way that prices were managed there was never made for it. And that was something that taxi operators couldn't do. Taxi operators had those rates set by regulators. And unfortunately, this is something that's going to continue to be a challenge. If you look at what's going on with Amazon, and I think this is one of the things I've been arguing in the transportation space, is that all this attention's gone to passenger transport. The real impact that we're going to look at going forward is going to be on freight and the way that we use streets for other kind of goods transport. Amazon's building the largest commercial fleet in the United States, like by a miles, and they have the same bizarre kind of cross subsidies occurring there, and they're doing all sorts of stuff around the way we think about market pricing to subsidize those trips. And those tools that they actually use to do that, and the kind of regulatory tools we have as cities to hold them accountable, aren't the same as we have for passenger transport. So because we didn't have a conversation about how markets work around passenger transport, we have this very limited set of tools around taxi regulation. We're going to find out really quickly we don't have any theoretical framework how we're going to regulate freight, and that was going to leave us in a really unfortunate place.
I would just add one thing to that, which is a lot of this discussion and the examples Kevin was given were really focused on the impact on the physical space of the city. But it's important, I think, to have a kind of regulatory framework and a regulatory way of thinking, not just for the physical space, but also for the digital space, right? And how these pieces kind of fit together, right? So we work with transit agencies, and we often work with transit planners, and they're often not thinking about, oh, how does Via connect with the transit app? How does Uber connect with the transit app? How does the transit app connect with mobile ticketing issues, right? And so those are things that on the industry side, right, there are relationships that are developed and like integrations that occur. But from the agency side, there is a kind of regulatory framework for not just, okay, how do these services impact the physical realm of our streets, but also how do they connect together in order to actually achieve the goals we're trying to get, and mode shift, reducing car usage, et cetera. So yeah, it's a regulatory framework that you have to, a regulatory kind of frame of mind you have to have in order to achieve these goals, and it's not fundamentally about the data.
Great. Thanks so much. All right, this was fun. You guys got talking, which was my goal. I'm talking a lot. Let me think. So let's talk about money, because a lot, private companies have different interests and different stakeholders. One of the questions that actually Kitty asked that we talk a little bit about was thinking about the sort of changing macroeconomic climate that's happening, and how the big shifts that we're seeing going on right now is or may affect a lot of these transportation technology companies. So, right, just yesterday, there was big news about Bird, a microtransit company. I don't want to characterize what they did with their financial books, but it doesn't look good for their financial outlook, right? And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you see happening in the next 5 or a couple of years in the transit technology space.
I guess, Nick, since I kind of put this question out there, I'll start. I guess why I was thinking about it is because, like, coming from Via, we have a very different operating model than a lot of other companies in the transit tech space. Like, we have a very direct relationship, as I mentioned earlier, with government agencies. We're contractually providing software for them to operate their transit systems, or we're operating transit systems on their behalf. But that's definitely not the case for a lot of the rest of the transit industry, transit tech industry. And I guess as a consultant, prior to joining VIA, a lot of the conversations that I was having with government agencies at the time was like, what are these different mobility options going to do within the transit space? And I think the response that I got a lot of the time from actually leaders in transportation planning or government was, doesn't matter, they're going to pay for themselves, they're just going to like do their own thing. And the assumption has always been that like venture capital is going to pay for it all and it's just going to be there. I think that's very quickly changing, as we can see that like the landscape is changing. These mobility options have over the past decade become very ingrained in the fabric of our cities, and I think they have had a great benefit in many ways to the way that people have traveled. Micromobility, I think, like despite the challenges that we've had in terms of I guess like urban clutter and also just like monetization of a lot of these companies, they have made a difference in cities in the sense that they are providing new mobility options for people to get around that are much more sustainable than maybe people would have otherwise taken. So to see some of these go away, I think would be a challenge. But part of what I was thinking of was, what is the relationship that governments need to have with these companies moving into the future? Like, is it that more of these kind of B2G types of relationships need to be formed? Do we have to lean further on that side? Like, I don't have the answer for the next 5 years. I know I put that out of this question, but that's just what I want us to think a little bit about.
Well, I can pick that up. It's something I think about a lot too. Actually, we also have transit partnerships, as Kitty probably knows, and I think the focus of our transit partnerships is helping transit agencies, especially in low density areas, smooth out service and make their operations more cost effective. And so you can imagine you don't need a full-size bus to pick up a person an hour around some of these areas. Like maybe you can deploy a rideshare car. So we also believe that I think I was just at a conference where there were a lot of people actually talking about this and how the public sector and the private sector need to work together. There's always this intention of needing to work together, and there's always disagreement about how that works. And I also think that a lot of it, what's interesting to me is it's like for the private companies, many of them, whether or not they say so explicitly, need to operate in the public policy frameworks that exist. And that's how they plan. That's what they rely on. If there's a strong signal from the federal government, they're going to invest in EV charging. They will stimulate market creation for EV charging. If a city, like in the way that we operate in Paris is so different because we have a very strong signal from the mayor through her fuel efficiency, diesel ban, fuel efficiency efforts, her pedestrianization efforts, all of those things, our operations are very different in Paris. So I think that there's this kind of interestingly not enough probably conversation with the public sector and the private companies about what exactly is that dynamic, and not always a I don't know, ability or time or something to even find that alignment. I did get some feedback while I was hanging out with all these city people this week, city and transportation and technology people this week. And it was interesting. The most positive stuff was that even if we disagree, if we could just listen and try, that was so much better than anything else. So I thought that was really interesting, where that kind of like creating the environment where the private sector also feels like they're not going to lose some time, investment, resourcing to take a chance is important, and having that support of the city to do that ends up being important. So not a direct answer in terms of like, what does that partnership look like? But I do think that this is a very live conversation right now, especially with all the infrastructure funding that's going out.
To add to that, in terms of the signals that the government can send out and that kind of shape where the market goes, like the B to G versus B to C nature of companies also shifts, right? For us, it has, I know for Via it has, right? Via used to operate, B2C ride hail type services, but it's now really focused on B2G. Like for us, it's a kind of a hybrid model, right? Where we are a customer facing app. And so, we want to make sure that our kind of incentives are aligned to focus on designing for the kind of user customer experience. And so it's a subscription model, right? Where, we don't run ads, but you can, pay for additional features. But it's a hybrid in that, transit agencies can buy subscriptions for all of their users. And then, we become their app, right? And develop a relationship with them as their kind of preferred customer facing kind of mobile app, right? So depending on, as Shinpei said, the kind of signals that the government sends, companies will shift between these kind of different models, depending on basically what's possible, what's available out there.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add, I definitely agree. I think it's kind of interesting because I think a lot of cities and transit agencies don't know how powerful they are in helping to shape this conversation. A lot of transportation planners, I think, come from a very passive space of like, this is the regulatory framework, these are the policies, this is how I'm going to follow it. But in this space, a lot of things are continuing to be shaped. And I think they don't necessarily realize that they have a lot of power in shaping that conversation. And like maybe one small municipality can't do that on its own, but at scale, a lot of municipalities and cities and transit agencies together can actually make quite a difference in the conversation. But I think that goes back to Shinpei's point that it's an ongoing live discussion that a lot of different players are coming in and out of. And it's hard for smaller agencies to be able to be engaged in the conversation full time.
So I don't know if you all saw, but I like vehemently said yes as soon as Kitty said agencies don't realize how much power they have, particularly mid and small sized agencies, right? You think about, like Kevin was talking about earlier, about the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission kind of regulating Uber. The TLC is kind of like the top of the heap in terms of regulatory power and capacity. But even in smaller agencies, folks will often assume the regulatory frameworks that they have to operate in, as opposed to understanding that they themselves are the shapers of the regulatory framework. An RFP, is a huge opportunity for an agency to say, this is how it's going to work. Sometimes what they say doesn't match what's available in the market, and then the RFP will fail and you learn lessons from that. But if they do their job well of kind of learning from the market, okay, here's what's available, here's what's out there, and then saying, oh, the best folks that we work with at transit agencies understand what the different private operators can do, and then try to, like, through their RFPs, through their permits, through their requirements, kind of twist the arms just a little bit to make it do what they want it to do. There's huge power for that, right? So I love data standards, right? They are what feeds the transit app and makes us available in 300 cities. We don't do haute couture, data adjustments because there's a data standard that exists called GTFS or GBFS for bike shares and scooters. And, the past few years, there was this kind of learning curve where cities of all sizes were realizing, oh, we can require GBFS feeds of our scooter operators, of our bike share systems. And that means that they can show up in the transit app or in Google Maps or in Apple Maps. And that makes that system much more accessible to as many people as possible, so we can make it easier for people to take these new modes. And so realizing that, yes, you do have the power to require something or to seek something that does what you want it to do is hugely important. And oftentimes, yes, private companies will say to government, hey, you can do this, because obviously it's in their interest. They want them to do that. But there are discussions that I think are happening and can happen even more between cities, right? You have organizations like NACTO, you have other organizations to kind of help these smaller and mid-sized cities in particular, and agencies kind of unlock the power that they really do have.
I want to add one thing on this. I think it's important, especially for folks who are kind of entering the field right now. Sorry, we really recognize that like the last decade or so maybe the last 12 years has been a bubble, like, and not just in the transportation sector, but in our economy in a really significant way. And one of the consequences of that is that it's completely distorted our understanding of the economics of this entire and most of our economy, but transportation has been a kind of a more distorted than most. I mean, to the point where, like, this is public information and you can read about it, like, sovereign wealth funds, deploying money, through and paying for, ride hail subsidies in cities, or getting interested in, the transportation subsidy structures in American cities through venture funds, just enormous sums of money that we don't normally see in this space. And the consequence of that is it's really undermined folks in the public sector's ability to understand the economic model in which they're operating in. And I think it's led to some really profound confusion that's undermined the ability for, like Stephen was saying, for folks, even in small agencies, to think about how they will engage in this space constructively. Because to do that, you have to understand who your counterparty is and kind of what the economic model they're operating in that negotiation. And if you're dealing with a company that is subsidizing its operation through sovereign wealth funds, because the venture world is operating that way, you can't have a discussion about sustainability or economic models that is coherent. And like, I come at this as someone who's like worked in this industry before that was happening. And I worked at Open Plans. We worked with New York City TLC. And as a contractor, we built a bunch of technology for them, and they could come in and audit our books. I mean, they could come as a vendor for New York City TLC, they would come in and be like, we want to see how much money you made last year. And you're allowed to make 8% profit on this contract. And we're going to claw back everything that over 8% if you made more than that. We're going to look at line by line. And that sort of economic relationship just does not exist in the kind of current venture world. It's actually, all these weird subsidies are occurring where venture funds are actually subsidizing the innovation. And there's no discussion of like what profit model is, what the long-term sustainability is. And the reason why that's occurring, and this is actually something that I think is just recently being discussed more broadly in the technology industry, is that a lot of the innovation that was actually being funded was market innovation. It was about market capture and market growth. And there's very, very little technological innovation that's actually occurred over the last decade. And we're about to pay a price for that. I think we're about to kind of discover how little foundation we actually built technologically for all that money that got deployed. And if you're in the business of building public infrastructure, you should be really concerned about those differences. I mean, you should be concerned, do we just invest in capital and long-term infrastructure that we're going to be able to benefit from, or do we just plow a bunch of subsidies into something to make it look like it was working? And now we're going to find out that was based on an economic model that's not true anymore. And I think we're having that discussion in a bunch of spaces, but we're not having enough, I think, in the transportation space, given how much has been affected by that.
Great. So thanks so much. I want to give other people time to ask questions. So I'm going to start opening up for questions now. I think Nima has a question. My colleague Nima Kudva has a question online. And then also we'll have questions here from people in the audience with microphones. Yeah, they're over.
Oh, good.
Hi, Nima.
Hi, you unmuted me. Okay. So thank you so much. This has been such an interesting conversation to follow. The most interesting part for me is this regulatory question that all of you keep coming back to in one way or another. And of course, planners, should be at the center of this sort of regulatory world. And so I'm very curious. Now, I want to just do a quick recap of what I'm hearing, so we're all on the same page, and then I have a question. So in terms of a quick recap, these are the things I'm hearing, right? There's a mismatch. There's a mismatch of goals, and there's a mismatch of what, in that whole sort of data question, what we study because we don't understand what our goals are really well. So there's a mismatch of that. And this question of what the goals are keeps shifting based on whether we're talking about the private and the public. What is so interesting for me in the ways in which all of you are, I think, talking, is this assumption that the private and the public are very discrete spaces, right? And operating in very discrete ways, when of course, in the reality of the world, we know they're not. And so to go back to this question of power and money, right? To think that these two worlds are separate to me is astonishing, particularly in the United States when people just move between the two. Like, 1 minute the regulatory person is, next minute they're working in Uber, next minute they're back in Airbnb and whatever the hell, right? And so this way of thinking about the private and the public when the reality is that they are worlds like this, to me is very odd. So I would, so that's another part, right? In terms of our assumptions. So there's a goal question, there's an assumption question that I'm hearing you speak about, that we somehow have these discrete realms within which we're working, right? Then there's another kind of an assumption that I'm hearing a lot, or I think I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is a particular kind of a trajectory to regulatory change and regulatory change management, right? You have the folks on the margins, they push, they write blogs, they do the work of persuasion, and somehow, right, some rich man, generally men, are convinced that they're right, and somehow all this change begins to happen. And those rich men have a lot of money to do whatever the hell they want. And so what's really fascinating to me in this whole set of, so there's an assumption of how there's a trajectory. And yet now there's the confounding factor of technology, which is way ahead, moving at a speed at which we are not able to regulate. So coming back to my question, therefore, based on all these assumptions and summaries that I'm sort of, trying to hear from you, is this: where do we even begin to start studying the kinds of regulatory questions we want to study? Are you going to, so Kevin, I'm really curious, are you going to be saying to me, Nima, go back and study that moment in history when America electrified? Nima, go back and study that moment in history when we took back from robber barons particular ways of doing things. If we have to have new goals and we really need to understand a new kind of a regulatory landscape, somehow it doesn't seem to me that the tools we've developed are really that useful. And so if they're not, what moments are you suggesting I look at for this new imagination?
I love the way you frame that. And I think it's actually right. It is that, I mean, what's interested in me is going back and studying the Grange movement in the late 1800s and thinking about railway construction. Like, how do we fund and construct the railways, which is absolutely to your point, this bizarre amalgamation of public and private. And for exactly the same reasons, it was this weird moment where private capital was building public infrastructure. At the same time, it was transforming the market structure. And this goes back to my point earlier that I don't think I made very effectively about common carriage. What the railway companies what they were doing wasn't building transport infrastructure, they were doing market regulation, and they were deciding the prices on goods being delivered to New York City, and they were taking a cut on that. So they would charge different people different amounts of money to send grain from the Midwest to New York City because they own the rails and they could do that. That's exactly the problem we're grappling with, is about how that consolidation corporate structures perverts or distorts what we think of as a market economy. And I think we in the United States, one of the things I've noticed, and this is a real tangential aside, is that I think there's a lot of resistance when people start talking about market economies, and especially in the public sector, they think you're talking about this kind of neoliberal kind of thing. And it's not that. It's actually, how do we engage with each other as peers and have a transparent interaction if there's this perverting structure above us that's not functioning anymore? There's no information that's exchanged there. And one thing I want to say about this is that I think, to your point about what's caused this break in the public and private, in the way I think about it, is that the ways in which capital are being deployed right now are profoundly different than the way they've been in most of my life, and I think most of our professional lives. If you look back, but 1990s to the early 2000s, the way capital was deployed is that the public sector raised taxes and deployed money through bonds or all sorts of means that could deploy that for public infrastructure. And what's happened in the latter half of that period since then is that we're now looking to the public sector to raise that capital and deploy it for public purposes. And the expectations for return on capital are incompatible with public infrastructure. So what you end up with is like this break in terms of the economic expectations of that. And I actually had a really astonishing conversation with an economist when I was working at a very large company, which names will be left out for purposes. I was talking to an economist about this, who was just completely baffled by the whole smart cities industry. He couldn't understand why on earth would anyone in public world want the private sector to fund public infrastructure, because the public bonds are so much cheaper than private money is expensive. And he thought about it for a while. And he answered his own question. He's like, oh, I get it. You're basically betting on political failure, and this is arbitrage on political failure. You're charging a 4 or 5% premium on the fact that these people can't raise taxes. Like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I get what this is all about now. And I think that's where we are in terms of the public-private divide.
So
I
you'd
can't speak as
suggest,
eloquently as Kevin about this. I just want to add one thing. I'm not a historian, but a few observations about the examples that he held up, and even the kind of break. I agree a lot with how capital is being deployed and the shift in how capital is deployed. We really struggle. This is a very, I also think, US centered dynamic. In most of the other places around the world, there is much better public sector acceptance of market dynamics and being willing to deploy market tools in order to achieve public goals. And you can see that across all sorts of different infrastructure, economic development sectors, and not always with great results. Like, we can debate whether or not they achieve all the results that they aim to achieve, but they're just much more willing to go there. And then like one city that really stands out as having that very centralized view on this, like having that alignment means that you agree on the public goals, that the public and the private sectors agree on the public goals. This whole conversation has been about the misalignment between public and private goals, except at the very highest level, right? Like, we all agree that there's climate change and we need to reduce emissions and that we should be more inclusive and address systemic inequities. How do we do that? There is no alignment on how that is supposed to happen. But Singapore, extraordinarily centralized, it's authoritarian, there's no way there are very few democratic tools. You cannot change what the plan is going to be, but they deploy market tools to achieve their goals.
No, thank you. I mean, this is, I joined the panel not expecting this turn in the conversation, and it is fantastic. Thank you so much. It's really thought-provoking, and all your experiences coming to this.
The question you just asked, I think, was really profound. One thing I want to flag is that for folks who are not in the following this in city planning world, is to really look at what's happening inside the FTC right now. Because what I just mentioned about the kind of conversation about the 1890s, the people who are running the Federal Trade Commission now under Biden is probably the bright spot in US policy right now. These are folks that came out of kind of a re-examination of that history. And Lena Khan, who is the chair of the FTC, has written a lot about this. And there's a whole community professionally around political economy that's thinking about these problems. Right. Many of those people are actually city planners. And it'd be really interesting to see more city planners engage in that discourse.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nima, for your question. Do we have questions here in the audience?
Thank you so much. My name is Linda Shah. I'm also a professor here in the department. I wondered, I also, like Nima, think it's really fascinating to have a lot of private and non-governmental people all calling for greater government regulation. What a fascinating panel this has been. I was wondering, for all of you who are talking about the inadequacies of government regulation, how you would advise students who are sitting here to think about how to study and become prepared for the new world that you're talking about. And I'm drawing back to what Kevin began with, which is he took Bill Goldsmith's class and decided that planning was not for him. And then coming back to this idea that people in politics and power are very central to the work that is essential. So how would you advise us to teach transportation planning, or how would you advise us to think about the courses that we do have, how students should structure their approach? There's lots of students who are interested in data analytics and in design of the planning. What should they be doing and thinking about it to become effective in the future?
I have one perspective, which is I also came out of my graduate study was also a post-Marxist program. So it was a lot about power dynamics and understanding how cities are shaped through power. And I would say that I often find that planning and transportation planning, city design is very technocratic. It assumes that everyone is rational and that there's a logical way to get to the end. When we're very messy, humanity is very messy, we're political, the politics swing back and forth. depending on when you are. I'm a New Yorker. I live in California now. I am appalled. So when you brought up Prop 22, it's like, yeah, see, look at that mess. It's like, I think that the elected officials, in spite of all the romanticism around direct democracy, I discovered I strongly believe in Republican democracy and the role of the elected officials to do the job so the voters can live their lives. But I would get involved with politics. I would learn about political strategy. I would get involved with your local advocacy groups. I think data science, as we have all been talking about, it is only a tool. It is only an input. It helps you make the argument. It does not create the argument for you. And the other observation I'm just having from this conversation is that we need leadership. We need people to make some decisions. We need someone to put their foot down and say, this is what needs to happen in our public realm. And this is how everyone's going to work together to make it happen. And I think we need to be students of great leaders and political strategists and not believe it's not about the best arguments all the time. It is about persuasion and the political strategy. And that's just the reality of it. So I hope this isn't cold water. I hope this is exciting for some of the students in the room. This is really getting, really wrestling with people and putting people in the middle of the conversation.
I would strongly second that what Wenfei was saying, that get involved in politics, but think about what that means, right? It's not necessarily get involved in politics so you can amass personal power and move up the electoral chain. Some people do want to do that, but we were talking earlier about this breakdown between shared values and how to achieve those shared values. I think part of the root of that is that our political process doesn't necessarily, it rewards the people who are most highly engaged. And that is a distortion of the views of, majority of folks, right? Anytime there, I'll go back to my streets blogger roots here, right? Anytime a bus lane comes up for discussion, it's always the loudest, neighboring opponents who drive the conversation, right? It's not about who actually benefits from this. Does it achieve the goal we want it to? That's why there are organizations like Riders Lines in New York, right? To kind of build that political base of power and organize among transit riders to make sure that those interests are represented. But I think if we're going to kind of approach this as planners with a regulatory framework kind of systemically, building political power, among constituents that we feel can kind of accomplish these goals and get these voices heard, that's one way of doing it. But I think also changing the way we think about what our elected officials and our governments respond to, right? Elected officials, if you call their office and say, I live in your district, this is a problem, they will listen to you. But the thing is, most people are not calling their elected officials, right? Most people are not organized as a block to show up to community meetings. It's only in specific cases where the fire gets hot enough to push them to want to do it, or if they have, frankly, enough time and money on their hands to do it, right? So as planners, right, if we're trying to think about this systemically, I think we have to think about what are the mechanisms that engage the population to tell elected officials, to tell civil service what they want, and how can those voices be heard on a regular basis outside of the occasional meeting, outside of the calling up a reporter, outside of an election, which is a very kind of messy way of having your voice heard because it's about all of the issues all at once, right? What are the mechanisms where we can get feedback from as broad a base of people as we can in order to inform those decisions, so that way there can be this shared agreement about what the goals are?
I'll echo what everyone has said so far in that I think focusing on the people is probably the most important, and understanding who the people involved in this process is probably the most important part. But I also want to give a bit of hope to the students in the room who are maybe coming from a more technical space and maybe more interested in data and the physical aspects of what you're working on in the urban planning space. That I think there still is a really important role, but just in how you're dealing with it. Like when it comes to data, I think the trap that planners and engineers often get trapped in is that you look at what data is available and you kind of find the easiest way to do it, right? Like you find the easiest way to analyze it and you take the data at face value. And I think when we started this conversation, we focused a lot on how data in and of itself is not enough. And so I think it's really important to think about what questions you're asking of that data, and also trying to figure out different ways that you can use that data to tell the stories of the people underlying it, right? Like at the end of the day, we're trying to understand what the behaviors are within this system, whether it be riders of a transit system or the behaviors of your constituents or whoever the decision makers are. So having that lens and that objective in how you analyze things is very important. So definitely don't let the data drive the conversation.
I just want to add one quick thing. I think actually in some ways building on what you were saying, Wenfei, about kind of technocratic interventions, I think it's really important to think about expertise. I think we're kind of in a crisis in our study right now. We don't really believe in expertise and we're really kind of skeptical of it. And there's actually another side to that. There's a kind of flip side to that, which I think is really important, because planning is a technocratic field. I mean, it's fundamentally, one that, everyone in the CRP program is learning about how to be, kind of implementers of these sort of policies, is to be really aware of the kind of failure modes of technocratic interventions. And I think this goes back to something you mentioned earlier, which is the Singapore example, which is this kind of authoritarian models where you can be overly technocratic, and the kind of idea that you can build really top-down systems. And I think one of the things we're confronted with right now in the United States is a lot of people who believe in the good form of technocracy, kind of representing the public interest, are watching a moment of political failure undermine their ability to deliver on those results. So people are going into elected, office, or going into city government and political leadership roles. And I think this is one of the distinctions really important to make here is staff who do this as a career and people who are held accountable politically are in really different places right now in this profession. And the folks I've worked with who are on the political side are witnessing a crisis. They can't achieve the things they want to achieve. And one of the failures that occurs when that starts to happen is people start looking at technology and kind of higher level kind of interventions that are more abstract as a way out, is almost kind of a savior in that moment. It's this kind of form of technological utopianism that takes a hold. And this is not new. I mean, this is actually not something that's happening for the first time. There's a long history of this in this field. And I think it's worth, if you're teaching this, you need to teach about those failures. And there's a couple of books that I think it's worth talking about. One of them that I think is probably the most important book for anybody who's working on data to think about is to read Seeing Like a State, which is really about essentially that failure that occurs when you have people who are often really well-intentioned that end up doing just incredible amount of harm, and get overly enamored with their view of this. And I think what we're seeing right now in AI and the kind of discussions on data look disturbingly like the failures that occurred in the past. I mean, they're identical. If you just took the time to change the dates, they'd be the same story. And the other side of this goes back to Bill Goldsmith's sort of stuff, which is about really having a more concrete conversation about power, because those technological, those kind of utopian stories are really about subverting conversations about power. It's where the representative kind of government model breaks down and says, well, guess what? We have a system and there's rules and there's math involved and it's really complicated. And it's all going to work out fine. And so you don't really get to have a conversation about accountability for those decisions. And that's what we're seeing, I think, right now in a lot of this field is folks who are leaning on that data as a way to deal with resource allocation problems that are profoundly political, and they don't have good political backing for some of the changes that need to be made. Like taking away something from someone is a really hard thing to do. And we're going to have to do that in the United States, just as reality. So you'd much rather have a computer do it or have data tell you that you're going to do it. And that's where things go really wrong. So having those sort of discussions about failure are there. I think there's a couple of other examples about kind of race and power that also need to be talked about. But that, I think, the really fundamentally data story is that we've done it before, and it's always about the data being precise enough this time to justify it, and that's never been true.
Great. Do we have any more questions here? It looks like we have one in the chat. Stephen, I think this is a question that maybe is best for you. Do you see it in the chat?
Yes. Is this, hi all, I have a question about social media or comment data.
Yeah.
All right, I'll let you go for it. I'll let you ask it.
Okay, hello everyone. I really admire what you have discussed in this panel. I am doing a little research about the social media comments about the transit service quality, but I still found it very difficult for me to extracting people's attitude for the transit service through this very messy or kind of like messy data. So do you guys think this is a good source for the private sector to consider as a way to understand what people are thinking or what they want in the future? Or do you think it is not a very good, it is very noisy for you to extracting important information? So this is just my confusion. Thank you.
You're talking about from social media?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would lean to say no. So we actually did some surveying of our users at Transit App on how they communicate with their transit agency and how they get information about transit service. And then we asked, what's your income? What's your race? What's your age? To see what the correlations were. And the most beneficial ways for agencies to communicate with the riders and for riders to communicate with agencies were obviously in the system itself, right? Signage, announcements, physical things in the system. Then, of course, there were apps, whether it's transit or others. Lots of folks are using those on their phones. And then it kind of fell off from there. You had like agency call centers, the agency website, and then way down at the bottom was social media. And interestingly, social media public meetings we found in the US, were more likely to be used by people who were whiter, people who were wealthier. So as a venue, as a mechanism for engaging about public transit, whether that's receiving information or giving feedback, it is not necessarily representative of the ridership as a whole. And so you're going to hear about different things than you would through other mechanisms, right? It's not that you, I think, shouldn't, like, I'm not saying agencies should not have Twitter handles and Facebook pages, but, these tools are designed to be kind of very easy, right? And particularly in a resource-strapped transit agency, it can be, I think, really tempting to say, okay, we tweeted about it, we did it, great, we moved on. But in fact, making sure that you have a real-time data feed that includes cancellations, right, is very important, because otherwise you're stranding people at the bus stop and they're not going to check the Twitter feed, right? Like, having this information available is I think fundamentally the most important. And then in terms of getting feedback back from users, right? We've started doing that in the app. Agencies do all sorts of intercept surveys, which can be, time and resource intensive. But I am, as someone who's been on Twitter way more of my life than I should, I am very down on social media as a mechanism. I'm going to drop a link to the surveys that we did in our app on this.
Okay.
I think that's a great way to end and return to the beginning of our discussion about data and the usefulness of data and what it can and can't tell us, and the balance between traditional data sources and questions that transit agencies should be asking and how they're getting data. So I want to be respectful of our panelists' time and also thank them for this really amazing and wide-ranging discussion. I definitely did not expect the Greenwich movement would come up in our conversation, but I was delighted it did. So thank you all. For the students, I'll just say this is the final, right, Linda? This is the final colloquium we have this semester. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to Linda and the TAs and the technical staff for organizing this great series of talks. And thanks to everyone for a great panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.